Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Let's start with information about the mutated versions of the CCP virus. Whilst in past weeks we've focused primarily on the UK variant, there appear to be two new strains, one from South Africa and the other from the United Kingdom. These two new strains are somewhat important for a variety of reasons. The big factors to be concerned about at the moment relate to whether or not vaccines that are currently available will work with these and will continue to work. Second to that, and in some ways somewhat more important, is that the new variations on the CCP virus are much more infectious. The fact that they're infecting more people more quickly means that hospitals are getting overwhelmed or will be overwhelmed in very short order. We know that this particular virus strain varies from the original by genome sequencing. Of the two, they both have very similar mutations. These largely lie in the receptor binding domain. This is the part of the virus that allows it to attach itself to the cell, inject the viral RNA, and then create a new host that way. The problem with this is that these new mutations were beneficial, unlike most mutations would be, and that means it is more infectious than the original was. Simply saying more infectious has little value, and attempts to estimate just how much more danger there is have led to an estimate of between 50 and 70% increase in transmission. Perhaps the only good news to come out of this is that although more infectious, the new strains are no more likely to kill someone. This, of course, ignores the fact that less available beds would inevitably lead to a higher mortality rate, but the virus itself does not lead to more deaths. There is a very important caveat to that statement. When we look at the original CCP virus, it had a reproduction rate of 1.1. That means every infected person would infect 1.1 more people. It also had a mortality rate of about 0.8%. This means that every month 129 people would die on average. When we look at this new variant with the lower end of its infectious spectrum of 50%, that number rises and rises considerably. It goes 129 deaths a month to 193 deaths a month. Understand that that is at the lower end of its theoretical infectious spread. It could be as high as 70% and in some cases 75%. That's not the whole story though. Because this is more infectious, it's not just 193 deaths you have to worry about. This is just based on the initial numbers. Once you start allowing for its growth, and it would be exponential growth in theory at the moment, as it appears to be able to reinfect the hosts who have had the original virus, that death rate rises to 978. We go from 129 to 978 deaths in a month, just with a 50% increase in infection. This is why it is such a concerning development for many countries, and especially countries that are already struggling with their medical system to provide support for patients who have been infected. With that very chilling piece of information, we now look at America, where exactly this consideration has hit. We've mentioned in recent weeks that America is facing a massive issue, particularly in California, where their hospitals in some counties have effectively no capacity for new patients. Hospitals are often being put on bypass, which means they have to go to another hospital rather than the one they should have been going to as it was nearest. This is a big problem. Once you have one hospital on bypass, the chances of another hospital going onto bypass grow exponentially. And once you get to a position where you have a constantly increasing number of patients with the CCP virus, urgent need for more rooms, but inability to provide them. Patients get shoved onto another hospital, and then that hospital has to go into bypass, and so on. This means that you eventually get to a point where all hospitals are at capacity, and nobody can get in. This is what we are seeing in some counties in California, specifically Los Angeles County. As we mentioned in past weeks, more than 2/3 of their ICU beds are occupied, and these are occupied by CCP virus patients. There are more than 8,000 people in that county alone who are hospitalized due to the CCP virus. This is a huge increase, and we're not talking about a small problem here. As we've mentioned with the UK and South African variants of the virus, if this continues the way it has been, their already overstretched capacity may not be able to manage no matter what they do. According to some reports, the ambulance crews have been given chilling instructions. They are not to take patients with little chance of survival to hospitals. That is, if a patient is suffering from a heart attack or similar and unable to be revived, they are effectively considered dead before they see a doctor. Of course, that's not the only problem ambulances will face. If you do actually manage to be revived and get to a hospital, you may not be admitted for hours. The reason for this is simple. The hospitals are rushing to try and find somewhere to put new patients, and in some cases, they have to send them elsewhere. There is no capacity. Health officials have said that the situation may get worse, and over the next 4 to 6 weeks, their system is going to be stretched to its absolute capacity, and that is what's going to be critical in their ability to try and head off the continued growth of the CCP virus. We've also seen this particular tweet come up several times. This tweet summarizes the Californian situation perfectly, and specifically for LA County. 1 in 5 people who have been tested has the CCP virus. They have exceeded ICU capacity, and there are, as of this tweet, 8,000 people hospitalized, and as of this week, more than 8,000. Despite this, people are still ignoring health advice, primarily to stay at home, wear some sort of face covering, and more. This has led to the situation that we have just described, the complete and exponential growth beyond capacity of anyone to imagine until it happens. We do have some interesting news though on the vaccine front. Primarily this regards China's vaccine. China has several in the pipeline, and one of these is being distributed. It's by a company called SinoPharm. SinoPharm's vaccine is being mentioned in this video, not for good reasons. It is considered the most unsafe vaccine in the world. It has in its information package 73 side effects. Some of these are not insignificant. Most vaccines will have several side effects that you can predict: pain around the injection site, headaches, and a few other things involved in the immunological reaction, or having something foreign injected under your skin. These generally go away in 24 to 72 hours. What we find highly disconcerting for an approved vaccine are some of those 73 adverse reactions. High blood pressure, which, okay. Loss of taste, weird but not particularly worrying. Delayed menstruation, which is highly unusual. Urinary incontinence, again disconcerting and something of a problem. But then you have things like loss of vision. These are not insignificant side effects. This is even more important when we look at just how effective this vaccine is. It has a less than 80% efficacy rate. It sits at somewhere around 79%, and that's based on clinical trial data. As you can imagine, the Chinese Communist Party was less than pleased when this was put onto public social media. And as a result, the person who published this information has effectively had their social media accounts in China completely shut down. The big issue with this particular piece of news is that there is an arguable case that the companies in China who distribute this particular vaccine would be immune from prosecution or lawsuits from civil parties because the information is in that document. Given what we know about the CCP virus and the difficulty in getting vaccines to market, you would have expected there to be both more concern about it and more regulation. Companies such as CSL, working with the University of Queensland, stopped their vaccine development after they established that it was producing positive HIV results but not causing HIV. Then you have this list of 73 side effects, many of which should have stopped the vaccine in its tracks, and yet it's still being approved at this stage. Some of the impact from the CCP virus isn't as obvious, and this is where autopsies become quite important. The sheer number of people dying tells us that there's more to it than just the obvious. This also leads to a lot of autopsies, primarily to clearly establish cause of death. One of the worrying things that has been coming up on a regular basis with the CCP virus has been, in many cases, there are neurological symptoms. Neurological symptoms that we can't simply dismiss. Also issues that there may be long-term ramifications. And that's now being vindicated from autopsies, where there appears to be clear-cut brain damage from the virus. This is not just a lack of oxygen, which is also being exacerbated by hospital availability. Rather, it appears to be something related to inflammation from the immune system, but also very similar to what would happen with a stroke. These are two very unexpected results, and two that should be a worry. What the researchers have found is that immune cells have begun to surround areas in the brain to try and block them off and do what they're meant to do. There are also areas of what are called mini brain bleeds. This is damage directly related to inflammation, and it means that there were issues with blood supply to the brain. There are also issues that it's not just people who have been seriously ill in which this is showing up. There are younger people with pre-existing conditions who display neurological symptoms that are directly related to the CCP virus. There is a good chance that those who are demonstrating neurological symptoms might have similar phenomena happening in their own brains. This research clearly states that although they can't find viruses in the brain at the time of the autopsy, there was data to show that they had the virus in the first place, and that the damage itself appears to have been caused by the body's attempt to fight it off. We then need to look at other data that backs this up to make sure that what they're saying has some validity to it. Other researchers have found traces of viruses in the brain of autopsy people. Then there are issues with EEGs, which have shown encephalopathy, which is inflammation of the brain in CCP virus patients. That means that there's a whole lot of information lining up to indicate that infection does more than just what we initially thought, and that there might be a lot more neurological danger to patients than was initially thought. This has very dire consequences for the long-term future if there are enough people infected whom it has harmed. Going now from studies of the CCP virus to studies of the human body in general and health outcomes. Most people understand that fat is fat. What they don't realize is that the body has two primary forms of fat tissue: white adipose tissue and brown adipose tissue. White adipose tissue is what you would be familiar with when trying to lose weight. This is your beer belly or dad body. Brown adipose tissue is more centrally located around the kidneys and a few other locations. It has a large role to play in metabolism, and it has been shown that the more brown adipose tissue you have, or brown fat, the more likely you are to burn energy effectively. This helps you in losing weight. As you can imagine, if it's associated with the loss of weight and generally with being more healthy, it probably has a relationship to health outcomes overall. This is where looking into the body of individuals with this has come in. Primarily, how it can help people lose weight more effectively, even if they don't have a lot of brown adipose tissue to start with. The research appears to indicate that the number of people with a high brown adipose tissue deposits in their body had a much lower representation of those people who had cancer and other pathologies. This would indicate that simply having it in the first place would drastically reduce your probability of having diseases and pathologies. That means that people with a high brown adipose tissue concentration in their body have a head start health-wise over others. Going now from health-related news to interesting but very disconcerting animal and insect-related news, we need to go to Madagascar. Madagascar is perhaps best known for its lemurs and being a relatively isolated island. What is disturbing about Madagascar, beyond the fact that it's an isolated island, is that huntsman spiders have been creating traps in which they can capture frogs. Spiders are already unpleasant enough, but the fact that they're creating tools, so to speak, to capture much larger creatures and then consume them is even more worrying. The basic idea is very similar to a mousetrap. It involves creating a two-part mechanism with two leaves, using silk to bind them together. This creates a shady spot where the frogs will enter, much like a mouse coming to a piece of cheese. Once they get in there, they become trapped via the web. Because they're trapped in there, they can't escape, and eventually the spider comes along and eats them. This particular phenomena hasn't been well evidenced yet and is based largely on what is seen in the spider's behavior in a very small sample size, and somewhat more importantly, in the fact that it varies significantly from normal spider behavior. The amount of time and effort taken to create these traps, so to speak, is a lot more than would be worth the effort if it was for the spider's direct benefit of developing a short-term home. If instead they develop not only a short-term home, but also a trap which they will get food from, it begins to make more sense. This is also one reason why you should keep spiders that are visible alive and kill the ones that can't be seen. The ones that you do see are the stupid spiders, and you want to promote them in order to ensure that the spiders go away very soon. That's all the news items we have for you this week. Thank you for watching, and if you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have below.